Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Vargas, and welcome to Heart of the Matter. It's been a bit of a stressful time as you read the headlines and all the concerns about the Delta variant spreading. And gosh, the new statistics on the number of people who died of opioid overdoses during the pandemic. We set a new record. This is not the kind of record we want to set, obviously. But we know that nearly 14% of people surveyed said that during the pandemic, they began to drink and abuse drugs more to deal with the stress and anxiety and depression that so many people suffered. And in today's podcast, I'm talking to a writer who has written a lot. She is an editor at large with the Daily Beast. She's written 3 books. She writes frequently for the Atlantic magazine and Vogue magazine. Her name is Molly Jong-Fast, and I've long been a fan of her work. She's written very pointedly and piercingly, I think, about what it was like to be a sober woman during the pandemic in the global epicenter, which was New York City a year ago this time, and to be the mother of 3 kids. It was tough, and I think she captured it a lot. She's been sober since she was 19 years old, so we're talking more than 2 decades of sobriety, but really understood and sympathized with why so many people might have struggled during this time and why so many people are still struggling now. This is something from an essay in Vogue that she just wrote. Of course, we'll never be normal again. The scars of a pandemic will be indelible, will shape us in ways we can't even begin to guess. The worldwide death of millions will linger in our collective consciousness forever. My grandfather, who died in the 1990s, never got over the flu pandemic of 1918. He developed small habits shaped by his fears. He never took the bus. He walked to work every day. He took handfuls of vitamins. He never got over the miracle of surviving the thing that killed so many of his siblings, his friends, his peers. We aren't the people we were in January of 2020, and we never will be. And we Americans are the lucky ones. COVID still rages across most of the world. Molly nailed it there. It does still rage. And as we're seeing in the headlines lately, there are parts of this country, vast swaths of this country, where there are many who are unvaccinated, and it's still raging. So I was really happy to speak with Molly Jong-Fast about surviving the pandemic in the global epicenter, about staying sober in a time of great stress, anxiety, and fear, and about raising kids to be healthy and happy in a world that seems increasingly unsafe. I think you'll enjoy her. Molly, welcome to Heart of the Matter. I am so happy to have you here. One of my favorite people.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we've got so much to talk about. We are now sort of, dare I even say it? I feel like I'm tempting fate when I talk about, the end of the pandemic. I don't know if you do this, but I find myself worrying that we're all relaxing too soon and that some horrible thing is going to come hit us and, wipe out humanity. I think I need to talk to a therapist about all my apocalyptic visions.
I think everyone is a little worried about that. And the truth is we still don't, for so far, we've done well with the variants and the vaccines, but we don't know yet, right?
Yeah,
there could still be more.
We don't know. How have you fared through the pandemic?
I think I've been good. I felt pretty good, but it's definitely been hard. And I think it's been really hard. There have been sort of different phases that have been hard for different reasons.
Right. You wrote a couple essays actually for Vogue magazine about, parenting in the pandemic, surviving in the pandemic, staying sober in the pandemic. And one of the things I liked that I read that you wrote was, it's been a year that, at least for the privileged, vacillated between extreme suffering, intense grief, and mind-numbing boredom. It's been both the saddest year of my life and also one of the most revealing. This juxtaposition has been strange, but I appreciate the hell out of things I used to take for granted. And I hope that my appreciation for the small and mundane never goes away. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think it is true that we are kind of like certain things. I mean, a good example is going to movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we couldn't go to the movies, like things that were easy that we took for granted, like going to the grocery store. I mean, a good example is back then I would say during the height of the pandemic, I would say, well, I don't know if it's worth the risk of going to the grocery store
Mm-hmm.
because we didn't know how you got it. We didn't know whether or not it was safe to go to the grocery store. I mean, we didn't, there was so much virus sort of coursing through the air. We did not know if we'd be okay. And now we are in this, now I go to the grocery because I'm fully vaccinated. I go to the grocery store and I don't think at all, like, is it worth me possibly getting this virus? And I think that's a pretty enormous change. So I definitely felt like it, and, we didn't go on airplanes. We couldn't go in taxis and buses. They stopped the subway. I mean, you'd see these pictures of empty airplanes flying around. I mean, it was just a very different time.
And you made another point in another one of your essays about staying sober during the pandemic, that you write, if a pandemic doesn't make you feel like drinking, nothing will. I still want to turn off my head and check out. Yes, I had stayed sober through 9/11, but this was different. This was slow and scary and kept going.
Yeah. I mean, 9/11 was so interesting because I was 2.5, 3 years sober, watched the planes hit the towers on television. And my stepfather called me up and said, you got to go grocery shopping because they're going to close all the stores, which they didn't. I mean, but they did close all the streets. And for a day, 24 hours, there was no traffic, no in, no out. Manhattan was completely cut off.
Right. But bridges and tunnels closed.
Right. We walked down, an avenue to go to a meeting. We had an AA meeting. It was scary, but it was sort of very quick, and you smelt the smoke and you saw the smoldering ash. I mean, up until I remember that in October, I took a flight and we flew over it and it was still smoldering.
Yeah.
So it was certainly traumatic. And but this is the difference between living somewhere where there are 2,500, 3,000 people dying and 25,000, 33,000 people, tens of thousands of people dying is a large difference, in scale.
Right.
And then also it just went on and on and on, not the way 9/11 did.
Right. It feels like I'm exhaling and doing things. I'm no longer, you talk about grocery shopping. I'm no longer going and wiping down those. I mean, my God, grocery shopping became an epic, you put on a hazmat suit and, and go into a tiny store in Manhattan where it's impossible to socially distance with your mask and your rubber gloves and try and remember not to touch anything on yourself and then go home and wipe everything. It was the sort of chronic, steady stress, the drumbeat of stress of it was really, it was really something. And I worried about my kids. I know I definitely worried about my kids. We know that there are statistics show that there is a huge jump in mental health issues, depression, anxiety as a result of the pandemic. And the age group that it affects the most is young adults.
Yeah, I definitely think it's been the hardest for my older teen than for my little teens, because my little teens are just sort of more elastic at that age. But I also think some of it is that for younger people, for teenagers, they don't have the same kind of frame of reference. Like I've had 42 summers, and 42 Christmases, and I've seen, and I've seen what like a down year can look like. And I don't have the same, when you've only had 17 Christmases, you have a different frame of reference. But I also think some of it is because America was so polarized and the virus, there was a whole part of the country that was saying it's the lockdowns that are making people depressed, not the pandemic. When the reality is, like, you had to have the lockdowns because otherwise you would just have what we have in India right now, or what we've had in, what we saw in Sweden, where they just couldn't control the numbers of the pandemic. So
because they didn't lock down. They didn't lock down. Sweden was the great experiment. Let's just not lock down. Everybody live your life, do your thing.
And they didn't.
You get it.
Yeah, and they died in larger numbers than they did in Norway. And that, and in whatever the other neighboring country is, Finland. And it just, and that was a choice, right? That was the government's choice. And in the UK, it was sort of a similar thing where they could, they just, and UK has ended up with much longer lockdowns. And now they've really gotten on it with the vaccines. But it was hard. I think it's very hard. And I think that it's very stressful, and there's a real mental health crisis that we see now. With it's funny because it's like, I think that the way media reports, it's not, we sort of aren't, so we don't want to blame mental health for problems. We want to blame other things. So, for example, here we have a situation now where there's a labor shortage, right? And so these 23 Republican governors have decided that it's because of the enhanced unemployment is too generous, right? Okay, I've had economists on my podcast who have said that's not really what's going on, but all right, so even say that's true. So they've decided to cut the enhanced unemployment in the hope of getting people back to these frontline worker jobs. But the frontline workers were the people who died in the largest quantity. And they're the people who are, hesitating to go back to work. And the minimum wage is the lowest in America of any affluent country. So, you have to wonder, like, if you're a frontline worker and you've had a person die who you worked with, or more than one person die who you've worked with, why you would want to go and risk your life for a job that doesn't pay you enough to stay above the poverty line.
Right. It's interesting. I saw a piece on I think CNN last night about, all these people during the NBA, championships who are throwing things at the players, and all the horrible behavior we're seeing on board airplanes with people punching teeth out of flight attendants' mouths.
Yeah.
And they showed a picture of a woman spitting speaking of a minimum wage job, at a fast food worker because they asked her to wear her mask inside the establishment, and she refused, and then she spat on them. Jesus. And they were talking to a mental health expert about what's going on? What happened to civility? What happened to the ability to, have different points of view and still coexist and respectfully, not attack people with the venom and lash out physically? And they said that people are so stressed out right now that this pandemic has wrung it out of people. The patients, they're exhausted, they're stressed, they're anxious, and it's all, leading to supremely bad behavior. Do you buy that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think people are very stressed out, and they don't know how to, I think, we have a mental health crisis. You have people who have been in their houses for a year, right? And then there's a statistic that 19% of all Americans have had a close friend or family member die of the pandemic.
Wow.
It's humongous, right? So you have a country of mourners, right? And there's no world in which this country of mourners is going to stop being, you don't snap out of grief. And I think that you have this weird combination of factors, right? You have the loss of all these people, hundreds of thousands dead. And then you have this weird polarization in America, political polarization. And then you have, we don't know what percentage of these Americans are long haul COVID survivors, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, that, and so you have all these different factors. And then you have another thing, which I don't know what the statistics on it are yet, but then you have people who are sick who didn't get medical care during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So like you have people who have cancer who didn't get chemotherapy, and people who had, who might have had their heart disease treated, but because they were scared to go to the doctor, have not. So you're going to have all these other kind of illnesses of like not going to hospitals, not going to doctors, which is another phenomenon. I mean, so I think it's very tough. I think it's going back to normal, but it's also like addressing a year of loss.
When we talk about the lack of civility in dialogue today, I'm struck by something that you wrote, an essay, actually an op-ed titled "When Joe Biden Spoke of Hunter's Struggles with Addiction, He Also Spoke of My Own." And you write, "When I look at Hunter Biden, I see myself. I did enormous quantities of cocaine in my teens, eventually getting sober at 19. To the normal, compassionate human being, bringing up the troubled 50-year-old son of a man who'd already lost 2 children tragically might seem excessively cruel. President Trump lost his own brother, Fred Jr., to alcoholism in 1981, something President Trump has only rarely talked about. What Trump didn't understand is that most normal people have empathy for the brutal, protracted, sometimes lifelong struggle that is addiction. The exchange highlighted that one presidential candidate had empathy and the other thinks addiction is a moral failing." Talk about that moment, because I remember sitting on my couch watching that debate and thinking and cringing every time, he brought up Hunter, as someone in recovery.
Yeah.
Because it felt like taking a club and bashing somebody where they're bruised.
Yeah. I mean, I interviewed Hunter for my pod, and like, I mean, it's addiction is like such a norm. It's such a like, it's always the same story, right? You have it, you ruin your life, you either get sober or you don't. So I don't know. I mean, the idea that Trump would do anything that isn't the most disgusting thing is sort of, it sort of seems impossible to me. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a dumb play, right? I mean, if you're an addict, you're a sick person getting well, you're not a bad person getting good. So the idea that he would
politicize it.
Right. And also just make a case that this was somehow, that somehow this son was evil because he was sick is, and it didn't work for him. Right. So I think that is still, it didn't work. People in America don't hate their addicts. We don't reject our sick and put them on an ice floe. We treat them. So I think that it clearly did not work for him.
Though, that a third of all Americans believe addiction is a moral failing or a character flaw.
Yeah, I mean, that's nuts. And it's nuts.
Yeah.
But I mean, the flat earthers, Americans right now, America's not covering itself with belief glory right now.
You have written very openly and honestly about your own recovery. You actually even wrote a novel. You wrote a novel, a fictional, first of all, how autobiographical was the novel?
It's sort of autobiographical. I wrote it when I was 19. So like I wrote it so I didn't have to go to college because I had dropped out of college, and my mom had told me I had to go back to college. And then I had decided that if I wrote a novel, I wouldn't have to go back to college. I mean, it's pretty dumb, but I did do that. It's a little bit autobiographical. I mean, in some ways not as much, but I certainly did a lot of drugs and did a lot of drinking. Novels are fun. It was like in the vein of that kind of like Bright Lights, Big City kind of thing. They're fun to do. I mean, they're also like, I don't think I would write that novel now, but it's been like 20 million years. So
you wrote in The Atlantic about getting sober. I joined AA at 19, mostly because I loved cocaine, truly loved cocaine, but also because I loved vodka and cheap white wine and diet pills and Valium in enormous quantities. I wanted to not die, so joining was easy, helped along by the knowledge that I came from a family of female alcoholics. My mother had written novels about her drinking. My grandmother was famous for her drunken vomiting at various fine restaurants throughout Manhattan. So on November 1st, 1997, I boarded a plane for Hazelden Treatment Center in Minnesota. AA saved me. What was that like? And how did you make that decision at 19? And, you know, because you were one of the, honestly, I think you're one of the rare people in the rooms that got sober the first time you tried, right?
Well, there's actually, there are, I don't know what the percentages are because there's really no good polling or
right.
About this, but there's a group of people who got sober in their teens who stayed sober. And it's a pretty known phenomenon in a certain way of people who get sober as teenagers. And because they don't have the same pathways in the brain, because they're a little younger, it ends up being they tend, and this is not always true for sure, and there's no scientific evidence to back this up. So do with this what you will. This is mostly anecdotal, what I've heard. But there certainly are a group of people who get sober in their teens and stay sober, and that it may be even a little easier because they don't have the same kind of habituation. I mean, I drank and took drugs for like maybe 6 years versus
26 or 36.
Years. Yeah.
Right.
There are definitely people who get sober in college and stay. I don't know what percentage it is of people in AA though. I mean, it may be small, but it's a phenomenon.
You write about the fact that you were like, wait a second, I'm going to turn 21 sober. I'm going to go to college sober. I'm going to get married sober. How am I going to be sober through all these things?
Yeah, but it's better than the alternative of like watching my grandmother drink. I mean, like, I don't, it get, as you get, so if you stay sober longer and longer, it gets easier and easier, right? I mean, I go to meetings every day, but
after 24 years,
23. But like but it gets easier, right? I don't feel like drinking anyway. Mostly I don't feel like drinking. Sometimes I do. And I don't, I mostly feel pretty good most of the time. There were a couple of times when I was first getting sober where I really felt like drinking. And for the first 5 years, I would have moments where I'd be like, oh my God, I need to have a drink. How am I going to survive this? But now I really don't have that, except sometimes, but almost never. And I used to have drunk dreams all the time. I don't have drunk dreams anymore. I mean, occasionally I'll have one if I'm traveling or something.
Those are the worst.
The worst. Now I just have like anxiety dreams or like dreams about, buying an apartment that has something, not the same kind of dreams, but it gets much easier. I mean, I think that is the thing I would say is like, as you stay sober, it gets easier and you get more even and more able to sort of take your own, like I can sort of have conversations with people and not think they're about me. And, I can sort of I'm a little more checked in. So, and I don't have to like act out as much emotionally, which is really cool. So yeah, I am a big fan of being sober and I would like to not be sober. I would like to stay sober.
You wrote an essay for The Fix about that time in rehab. You said, I'd always fantasized about going to rehab. Since I grew up with a vision of myself as a fuck up and as a degenerate drug addict, it made sense to me that I would eventually end up in rehab. Plus, it seemed like a very posh thing to do. Liza Minnelli went, so did Elizabeth Taylor. Everyone who was anyone went. And actually, it turned out I was pretty good at rehab. At first, I had an aptitude for brown-nosing the counselors in my wing at Hazelden. I was adept at telling them and the other patients what they wanted to hear. I had the vocabulary of recovery long before I had the recovery. And then the miracle came. I hate to use that word miracle, but it really describes what happened to me. Anyway, the miracle happened one day when I woke up in my bed and I just got it. I got that I had a disease and that if I wasn't honest and if I didn't do everything they told me, I was very likely going to die, or worse, not die.
Yeah.
I love that last
Oh,
line because
thank you.
that's the worst. The worst is sometimes not dying and struggling
I
with that
know
disease.
it's really grim.
Tell me about that miracle, that moment of clarity, that, life-changing thing.
I mean, I would say, I decided I wanted to stay sober. I mean, I think I always wanted to stay sober, but it just until you really get, I don't know, it's just something changed in my DNA, where I was like, went from person who was willing to, ruin their lives to person who wants to give sobriety a chance. And
And
I
you
don't
can't
know.
pinpoint like something someone said or something you saw
No,
or read. It was just
no.
something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's like the sort of the most, it's a sort of, I mean, for lack of of a better word, a God like intervention, you know.
Hmm. That's really, I read that book, Moments of Clarity,
Yeah.
written about essays from all these different people, but that moment that they had, that made them suddenly realize, I got to stop this. And
Hmm.
it's so interesting because some people's moments of clarity are big, huge, crashes. And some are what you described, which was, it's just a tiny, gift of commitment that happens apropos of nothing in particular.
Yeah.
But, without it, you can't do it. Right.
Yeah. I think that's right.
I also like that in The Atlantic, you wrote about a conversation with your first sponsor where you ask her, how am I going to stay sober forever? I asked, how am I going to stay sober and go back to college? How am I going to stay sober and live in the dorms? How am I going to stay sober and be turn 21? How am I going to stay sober at my wedding? She simply said, you're going to stay sober today, just right now. I paused. I thought she was kidding. Sure. But what about tomorrow? Maybe we'll drink tomorrow, she said. Maybe there'll be a nuclear apocalypse tomorrow, and then you and I can drink. But for today, just for today, let's just not.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I had that moment, back when I was trying to get sober. I remember there was this woman who was, I saw her at a meeting out in Long Island, and then I saw her at a meeting up in your neck of the woods. She was really had strict sort of sobriety, is what I would say. She was intimidating to me.
Right.
And I remember saying something to her like, I can't imagine not drinking for the rest of my life. And she said, you don't have to. You're not drinking today.
Yeah.
And that really, really helped me. Did it help you in that moment when she said that, when she broke it down to just today?
Yeah. I mean, I think also just like that, I've sort of gotten to understand that a little better as I've stayed sober. But yeah, for sure. 100%. Yeah. I think
So
that's
how do
right.
you, so day after day, you just commit to just one day, or is it not something you have to do every day anymore?
Now I just am like, it's not even, I mean, that now I feel like I can use it in a different way, which is I feel like all I have to worry about is right now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to, I just have right now, which I don't have to like be like, well, how am I gonna, I can sort of break time down in a little bit of a different way. But for sure, in the beginning, knowing that it wasn't forever was really helpful.
You have chosen to write a lot about your sobriety and about the fact that you're in AA. Have you gotten any blowback for that?
Yeah. I mean, years ago, I got more. Like when I wrote about my sobriety in the 90s, I got more blowback. And I was a little more like in the 90s, I used to say, I'm not an AA. I wouldn't say I'm not an AA because I didn't want to lie. I would say I'm clean. I haven't taken a drug or a drink since November 2nd, 1997. And then I wouldn't go into the AA stuff. Mm-hmm. Now it's 20 years later. I just feel like I just say I'm an AA. I say I'm an AA largely because I just feel like the culture has shifted, and that before I got sober, I didn't even know that AA existed, even though my mother had been in and out of AA. I didn't know. So I think it's very helpful for people to know that's how you get sober and stay sober, because there's a lot of like a lot of things like rational recovery or whatever, these crazy things where they, they California sober, right? Like sobriety that's not really sober. And those things are being advertised all the time. But just because we are Alcoholics Anonymous, we think we're not supposed to advertise what we do, but what we do actually works. So, I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, and it requires some amount of commitment, but so I don't think I would rather people get mad at me and help get a person sober than people be happy with me and we lose a drunk,
Do you think that we're starting to, I firmly believe stigma is one of the biggest things that keeps people from getting help and asking for help and admitting they need help because it's so stigmatizing. Do you think that by talking more openly about your own recovery and about AA and that you're helping destigmatize that? Because certainly we're seeing that when it comes to mental health, a lot more people are being open and honest about it, whether it's Naomi Osaka, who pulls out of the French Open,
right?
Because she admits she's, suffering terrible depression, or Prince Harry talking a lot about his, mental health. A lot of people are talking more openly about these things, that we used to keep secret and private.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, I certainly would. I've certainly tried really hard to destigmatize addiction as much as possible, especially because it's so clearly for at least for me, and I think largely true, an inherited illness, right? So, it's like I mean, it's the same thing as, a genetic disease or right. I mean, you don't blame people for having Canavans or Tay-Sachs. You don't blame them, for having, artificial, whatever, a misshapen
We don't blame them
organ.
if they get cancer.
Right.
Never mind the genetic thing. I mean, nobody says, oh my God, your cancer came back. We're going to fire you, or we're not going to pay for any more of your cancer treatments because this is the second round of it.
Right, exactly. So that's why I feel like ultimately we are, I try really hard to talk about it. I mean, I really do, and I'm happy to talk about it. And I feel like it's been really important in my life to be able to talk about it.
Finally, I know you're a mom of 3. How do you talk about it with your kids? Because you have talked about the fact that there is a genetic link that you can see clearly in your family with your mom and your grandmother. So what do you say to your kids?
I talk about it probably too much. Is
there such a thing?
I don't know. I don't know if it's too much, but I do say, like, I got sober when I was 19. It's genetic. I hope that for you guys, I basically say, like, look, alcoholism runs in your family. My kids have all sat in on AA meetings at this point. And, I say, like, this is, I explain to them about it. I also say, like, my husband has all this lung cancer in his family. So I say, like, you really need to not smoke too. And then I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens. We'll see. We don't really know yet how that turns out. Right.
Right. I talk to my kids a lot about it. And neither one of them says they've had a drink or tried anything. And I believe them, actually, but I fully expect there'll come a time when I don't know. It's interesting. I think it's hard to be a kid.
Very.
And to resist peer pressure. And I think that, probably when they go away to college, it would be a little naive of me to think they might not try this stuff. I mean, I guess. But it's important that they know. And certainly my 2 sons know my story. My oldest son read my book. I mean, he had a front row seat to, my little journey. So anyway, Molly, it's great to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you. You were great. We have survived so far the pandemic, and I hope you have a fantastic summer.
Hopefully I will see you soon. Well,
I hope so.
yeah, let me know because I'll meet with you whenever you want.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, we can go for a walk. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, you guys.
Thank you so much for listening today to Heart of the Matter. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website at drugfree.org/podcast. And as a reminder, if you need help with a loved one who is struggling with substance use, you can text 55753 or visit drugfree.org. We'll talk to you soon.